Ah, Cato, Cato, Cato. Cato the Younger specifically, as opposed to Cato the Elder, who really hated Carthage. A lot of people really like Cato. In particular, the libertarians seem to, even having the Cato Institute. Which I find hilarious because Cato would absolutely hate the libertarians' guts if he ever met them. Though, to be fair, Cato hated a lot of people, in particular Julius Caesar, but Caesar was one among many in many cases. And despite the fact that Cato is very much a beloved figure among many people, his actual history doesn't necessarily link up to it. And I'm not just talking about a case where someone in the past did things that people in the present day would consider morally dubious. I mean that Cato was, in many ways, a hypocrite, fraud, everything wrong with partisan politics, and frankly an idiot. Even people like Cicero, who seem to like the guy, do point out many of his flaws. Like in Cicero's case, he wrote that Cato doesn't have much sense, despite trying in this instance to do what Cato thought was right. Although I have my doubts that Cato thought what he did was right. Though, at least in that particular instance, which we'll end up getting to. But yeah, Cato himself is not the sort of guy that a lot of people think he was. And I'm going to go over him. Now, I am going to talk about the good parts of Cato, and these are why people like him. Or at least the two main root causes as to why people like him. So I am going to give Cato credit where credit is due. I am making this because after reading about Cato and learning about him, I came to dislike him. I did not dislike Cato from the start, and quite frankly, you should do your own research if you really want to make sure. Because as a disclaimer, I am going to skip over large parts of Cato's life, or at least many portions of it, because otherwise this video would go on forever. Or at the very least, it would go on for way too long. So, do your own research. Make sure, double check what I say and my sources to fully determine your own opinion on Cato. And I will give Cato credit where it is due. First off, Cato could not be bribed. In that regard, he was incorruptible. Also, Cato was very disciplined. I will acknowledge him for that as well. Now, reasons why people like Cato. 1. The aforementioned lack of bribability and excess of discipline, which genuinely give him credit for. 2. He projected an image of virtue. That Cato very much had the image that he was a virtuous man. However, I will also say that Cato was not as virtuous as a lot of people think he was. We'll go over some instances where Cato did some things that were very morally questionable, at the very least, compared to what his strict image is. Number 3, he was an enemy of Julius Caesar, and a lot of people like that he stood up to Caesar's tyranny, despite the fact that Cato was a big part of the reason why Caesar was an enemy of the Republic in the first place. And Cato also fought to his last breath for the Roman Republic, despite being part of the reason why it was in danger in the first place. And Cato, he does a few questionable things regarding the Republic. Certainly he respected it more than Caesar did, though, he's also probably part of the reason why Caesar didn't quite respect the will of the Senate at the very least. Though it should be remembered that the Roman Republic was more than just the Senate. It had the popular assembly as well as various officials outside of the Senate. The Senate was just one part of it, arguably for making political decisions the most important part, but not the only one. Now, who was Cato the Younger? So, Cato came from a plebeian family. He was not a noble, he was a commoner. And his family first gained the power, first got its influence from his great-grandfather, who was also named Cato, but he is not the Cato the Elder, that's a completely different person. Also, most of this is according to Plutarch. Plutarch is my main source on Cato's life here. I will bring up other sources when appropriate, especially for background information in some cases, but I should note that Plutarch likes Cato, but Plutarch is not afraid to call Cato out when Cato does something stupid or makes a mistake. So Plutarch is a reliable source because while he likes Cato, he wasn't biased in favor of him all too much. I hope I'm like that, but in the reverse, where I don't like Cato, but I'm not too biased against him. And once again, Plutarch describes Cato as inflexible since he was a child. And apparently Cato was a priest of Apollo, which isn't too uncommon for Roman politicians to also be priests. Like, Caesar himself was Rome's head priest, and a lot of the priests in Rome were expected to have normal political careers on top of being priests. Like, being a priest was a bit of a side gig, though that also depends on the type of priest you were, whether you were a pontiff, a flamen, or something else. Now, more on Cato's life. Cato served in the war against Spartacus, doing well to his credit. He became a military tribune, which was basically a sort of military officer in Rome, and he was popular among his subordinates. Cato became quaestor and did well, fighting corruption there, which I also give him credit for. He also refused to be bribed by others, and Plutarch mentions Pompey as someone who tried and failed to bribe Cato. Now, once again, the main source on Cato's life is Plutarch, so we should still be careful, but keep in mind that he did like Cato, but still, he is a reliable source fairly. Now, so far, Cato's life has been off to a fairly good start. He did well in the war against Spartacus, fought corruption, fairly popular. Now, we bring up the Catiline conspiracy. Catilina, this guy on the left, lost a few elections and got bankrupt as a result of it, basically. He lost way too much money from elections, and he decided that if he couldn't get into office, he'd take over Rome with an army. Also, our sources are not just Plutarch here, as I note on the bottom, but Sallust and Cicero. Speaking of Cicero, he managed to capture Catilina's co-conspirators, and he brought them to the Senate and asked what they wanted to do with them. Now, what did the Senate do with the conspirators? Decimus Junius Silanus, the guy in the coin, not the horse, suggested the death penalty according to Sallust, or according to Plutarch, the most severe punishment. Though that could potentially be a translation error, like, difference isn't really all that much, but I should note that the death penalty gives an absolute punishment, whereas the most severe punishment heavily implies death, but is something that Silanus can walk back on, which he ends up doing according to Plutarch. Now, in response to the suggestion of the death penalty, Gaius Julius Caesar, yes, that Caesar, the guy who very likely invented the book, may have invented the comb-over, suggested instead of killing off the conspirators without trial, they should be given life imprisonment. And the Senate started to turn in Caesar's favor. Even Silanus, as I said before, changed his mind and started flipping around. Cato flipped his shit in response to this. He reminded the Senate that Catilina still had an army right on their doorstep. He yelled at Silanus for changing his mind. He said Caesar was trying to subvert the Senate. He even accused Caesar of working with Catilina when a letter came. This letter was for Caesar. And Cato demanded that it be read aloud, pretty much just assuming that it was a letter from the fellow conspirators giving Caesar instructions. It ended up getting read aloud, and it turned out it was a love letter to Caesar from Cato's sister. A very vivid and detailed and NSFW love letter. Cato was not exactly happy with this, and he went right back to debating Caesar. So, this is also where Cato started to really, really hate Caesar's guts. Now, a question remains. Did Cato do the right thing by shouting at and pissing off Caesar? No, I don't think he did. Now, first off, so Cato pretty much assumed that Caesar was working with the conspirators, and that's why he offered mercy. However, Cato had no evidence. He accused Caesar of treason without any evidence to back him up. Like, he wasn't one of the people that Cicero caught, and Cicero got at the very least, most of the co-conspirators. In addition to that, there are other possible reasons why Caesar might want to show mercy, even if he wasn't involved with the conspiracy himself. Like, it's possible he was, possible he wasn't. It's possible he was friends with Catilina or some of the people there and just wanted to spare their lives, despite not being involved. It's also possible that Caesar thought executing people without trial, even in a moment of crisis, was a bad idea because it would set a terrible precedent. It's also possible that Caesar was just being merciful. Caesar was overall a pretty merciful person by the standards of the time. Like, by modern standards, he absolutely was merciless and brutal, cutting off an entire hand of Gaul, cutting off the right hands of all the men of a town that rebelled against him later in life. But by Roman standards, that was very lenient, and of course he spared his enemies later on, so Caesar could have just been being merciful. But Cato, now, I do generally think Cato had the right idea in this case. Like, there was an army in Italy ready to attack Rome. They needed to do something to deal with them, so I think Cato was in the right here in terms of his general plan, but basically going out insulting Caesar and accusing him of treason without evidence is taking things way too far, especially since if Caesar was objecting for one of the reasons like setting a bad precedent or to show mercy, like, those are some legitimate concerns. Or legitimate reasons, at least. Now, Cato ended up succeeding in convincing the Senate to kill the conspirators. So, the conspirators were brought out of the Senate by Cicero and executed. Most of the army that the conspirators gathered together just ended up retreating. And Caesar, after everything Cato said and accused him of, started hanging out with Rome's commoners and stirring them up. And note that Plutarch himself says that Caesar did it specifically because of Cato's words. Though, could have misread that, but yeah, Plutarch says that after the accusations Cato leveled against him, Caesar started stirring up the commoners. So, yeah, Cato kind of caused a bit of a problem there. And Cato also got the Senate to give up the commoners grain to keep them from causing any trouble, which actually worked, so good on him in this instance. However, Cato versus Metellus. Like, there are multiple Metelluses in Rome's history. This particular Metellus was a tribune of the plebs. Couldn't find a good picture of him. And I want to note that the office of tribune of the plebs was personally inviolate. This meant that it was death penalty to do any harm to them or to use any violence or physical force against them. So basically, if you were a tribune of the plebs and someone so much as lightly slapped you, that was a capital crime. Now, Metellus said that they needed Pompey to come in and crush the remaining conspirator army. Now, Cato did not want this. He was probably worried that if Pompey brought an army over, he'd try to just take over Rome himself. So Cato actually tried to be diplomatic rather than just yelling at Metellus like he did with Caesar. I don't know why. Maybe he realized that he messed up with Caesar and caused him to potentially cause more trouble, or maybe he just liked Metellus more. I mean, Metellus wasn't banging his sister, as far as I know. Now, Cato trying to be diplomatic in this case was actually the wrong decision at first. It didn't work, and Metellus said that he'd get Pompey over even if the Senate disapproved. So Cato changed tactics and said he'd rather die than let Pompey in Italy with an army. And, well, things basically just escalated from there with Cato and Metellus arguing. So the Senate's reaction to this was basically that. They concluded that neither man was in his right mind, but they were generally on Cato's side of not letting Pompey come over. Now, Cato and Thermus versus Metellus and Caesar. Because, after that big fight with Cato in the Senate, Caesar was all too happy to team up with Metellus. Assuming, of course, that he wasn't already allied with him, because, there's a lot of stuff we don't know. it's possible that Caesar was allied with Metellus already, but it's also possible that Caesar decided to use this as an opportunity. Anyway, Metellus took the vote to the people, the popular assembly, which bypasses the Senate. And it was technically legal for him to do this. It just wasn't a part of, Roman tradition. You were supposed to get the vote approved by the Senate first, but you technically didn't have to. Now, armed men and gladiators showed up in support of Metellus and the vote. Caesar also showed up to support Metellus. Cato teamed up with a guy named Thermus. They walked right up to the place where the vote was happening, ignoring the guards, just straight up ignored them. Now, things go horribly right or wrong. I'm not really sure how they went, in terms of whether or not they went how Cato wanted them to, or better or worse. I'll just tell you. So, Metellus started reading the law. Cato snatched the document directly out of his hands. Metellus then started reciting it from memory. So Thermus placed a hand on Metellus's mouth. Remember the personally inviolate thing? Thermus just committed a capital crime. And nothing would happen to him because of it, because the Senate would end up approving of it. Now Metellus, after Thermus put a hand on his mouth, called his armed guards in, and they threw rocks at Cato, but Cato ended up escaping. In the end, the Senate sided with Cato, and Cato got them to spare Metellus, either as an act of mercy or to avoid angering Pompey, who, while he wasn't in Italy, Pompey still... he still had an army. I'm not sure how I think about Cato's handling of this. Now, I personally do not think Pompey would have just come in and taken over Rome. And I think this because later on, Pompey did get a chance to do that. He later on was allowed to not just bring an army into Italy, but within the city of Rome itself, and he didn't just declare himself dictator. However, that is with the benefit of hindsight. Cato doesn't have the information to all of Pompey's life that I do. So, while I don't think Pompey would have done this, Cato couldn't have known that. And Pompey did work with Sulla, who basically did come in and take over Rome. I do also think that sparing Metellus was the right thing to do. So, I agree with that, but at the same time, Cato, I can't quite bring myself to blame Cato for what Thermus did, but I also don't think Cato disapproved of it, same thing with the Senate. However, it is a bit hypocritical of people who claim to be all about the laws of Rome and their traditions to enact violence, even in a mild form, on a tribune of the plebs. You're forcibly covering someone's hand with your mouth with your hand might not seem like much to us, but this was an act of violence against the tribune of the plebs. They were the people who were supposed to be the plebeians' representatives in the Senate. And they were specifically made so that you couldn't do any act of violence, however minor to them, to keep the aristocrats from just intimidating them into submission. So, I'm not sure how I think of Cato's handling of this. Maybe some of you could give your own opinions in the comments. Anyway, Cato and Pompey. So Pompey's that guy in the image of the statue. He was mentioned before already, we talked about him. Pompey was a Roman general, and he was absolutely brilliant, on Caesar's level. He was called the next Alexander because of his campaigns in Asia. But anyway, Pompey tried to get the Senate to delay elections. And Cato blocked this. This actually got Pompey to decide that he should try to make an alliance with Cato, he thought Cato might be a useful ally. So Pompey proposed that he and his sons marry Cato's nieces or daughters. He and his son marry Cato's nieces or daughters. Pompey married one and his son married the other. There is disagreements in Plutarch's sources. Some people said it was his nieces, others said he was his daughters. Now, Cato's wife and his sisters were overjoyed at this potential marriage alliance, because once again, Pompey was a very prestigious political official. He was popular, he was a great general, he was well-renowned throughout Rome. This was an absolutely great marriage. Now, Cato rejected this and said that if Pompey was a just man, he'd receive Cato's help, even without a marriage alliance. Now, I couldn't say it better than Plutarch did. So, in Plutarch's own words, however, if we are to judge by the results, it would seem that Cato was wholly wrong in not accepting the marriage connection. Instead of allowing Pompey to turn to Caesar and form a marriage which united the power of the two men, nearly overthrew the Roman state and destroyed the constitution. None of these things would have happened had not Cato been so afraid of the slight transgressions of Pompey as to allow him to commit the greatest of all and add his power to that of another. Now, this could be an example of hindsight is 20/20, but this won't be the last time Cato gives his enemies an opportunity to team up with each other. It wasn't even the first if Caesar really did decide to team up with that tribune back there based on Cato's actions. Now, here's the section I like to title, Cato Fucks Up Royally. First, the background. This is Crassus, Marcus Licinius Crassus in full. He is the richest man in Rome because he owned its only fire department. And buildings in Rome got set on fire a lot. Plus, he'd basically make people give him their houses if he wanted to avoid setting that, in exchange for putting out the fire, and then he'd, rent it back to them. Now, Crassus defeated Spartacus, but Pompey stole credit for it. So, Crassus and Pompey hated each other's guts. Now, to talk about tax collectors. Tax collection in Rome at this time in their history was done by private companies. These tax collectors would basically bid on how much money they could collect for the Roman state, and if they collected any extra, they'd keep it for themselves, and that was how they made money. Now, the collectors were fairly corrupt. No one liked them all that much, both because of that and because they were tax collectors, but the Roman state needed them to collect money. And the tax collectors in Asia Minor overbid on how much they could collect. Also, Pompey was warring in that area, which kinda destroyed its economic potential. Now, the tax collectors needed to be bailed out, and Crassus, as consul, which was a title basically equivalent to president or prime minister, if instead of one president or prime minister you had two of them, wanted to bail out the tax collectors. Now, this was 100% necessary if Rome was going to collect revenue. Because if the tax collectors get in trouble, less people are going to want to be tax collectors. And those tax collectors aren't going to be able to help the Roman state get more money. So they kind of needed to bail them out if they wanted the Roman state to collect more money. And this is a problem that could very easily end up causing a lot of troubles down the line if they weren't bailed out. Cato fucks this up. So the source for this one is Cicero's letters to his friend, Atticus. It was a real pain in the ass to find this primary source. I would like to thank Project Gutenberg for it. Now, the tax collectors, according to Cicero, were devoted to Cato before this, but Cato still kept the Senate from reaching a decision on this matter, basically stabbing the tax collectors in the back. Now, Cicero doesn't mention how Cato did this, but Cato probably used a filibuster. And I say this because Cato filibustered a lot. We'll go through a few of these later on, but filibuster is most likely what he used here. Now, Cato, keeping the Senate from reaching a decision, held up all the other things the Senate had to decide. Cicero mentions foreign embassies being unable to be decided because Cato kept holding up this decision for months. Cicero writes that it's been 3 months since Cato's been delaying the decision on the tax collectors, and that pretty much all Senate business was held up because of it. So that means that the Senate, because of this one issue that Cato didn't want them to make a decision on, and keep in mind that this is infringing upon the will of the Senate, but we'll get more into why filibusters don't have a place in Roman society later. But anyway, Cato was basically holding up the Senate from deciding many of the important decisions it needed to make, like who should go and visit the foreign kings to keep them having good relations with Rome. Yeah, and probably a bunch of other things too, since all Senate business was held up for 3 months. Now, oh yeah, here we go, an aside on the filibuster. So, a filibuster is, for those who don't know, when someone delays when someone delays a decision on an issue, like a vote in a political setting, by talking endlessly until the session has to be adjourned, like the meeting has to be adjourned, and then they keep doing this to prevent the bill from being passed or voted on even. Filibusters in the US are controversial, but they are generally accepted because they are seen as a way for the political minority to protect themselves from the political majority. Now, filibusters, while controversial, do have a place in American politics, or at least you can argue that they have a place. Because in the United States, only one person, the president, has the veto. So that means that if you want a bill vetoed, you have to convince the president to veto it. And if the president supports the bill, they're not going to veto it. And note as well that a 2/3 majority overrides the president's veto. So even if the president doesn't want a bill passed, if enough of the Senate and House of Representatives support the bill, then the president can't do anything about it. Now, in Roman politics, on the other hand, here are the people who have the veto. 2 consuls and 10 tribunes of the plebs. That is 12 people who with just one word can stop a bill from being made. All you have to do to get the veto done is convince one of those 12 people to do it. Also, their veto cannot be overridden. It doesn't matter if they're the only person in the Senate who did not support the bill, and literally everyone else voted in favor of it. The veto is absolute in Roman politics, which means that there already are ways for the political minority to protect themselves from the political majority baked into the Roman system. Because of that, the filibuster has no place in Roman politics. Like, no role, no place whatsoever. So remember this. Whenever Cato filibustered something, he either couldn't or didn't try to convince any one of these 12 people to veto something. Or he just didn't want to take chances and decided to bypass the Roman Republic's political process entirely to get his will done. Now, Pompey. We're going back to him. Pompey conquered a good chunk on Asia Minor. And the men who fought for him were owed land by the Roman Republic. This was the law. Like, it was under Roman law, soldiers who fought in a war were owed land. The idea was a bit multi-staged. First off, it was a way of rewarding soldiers who, by giving them some of the land that they helped to take over. Next, it also meant that you had a bunch of armed veterans with 10 years of military experience in the land you just conquered. If any of the natives are thinking of revolting, well, they'll have to get through the armed veterans first. Or at the very least, trained veterans first. I don't know for sure how many Roman soldiers who got in these places kept their swords. But still, having a bunch of trained veterans in the area would be a bit of a deterrent, especially since they could potentially end up going back to military service if there was a threat in the area. Like, they were free to sign up again if they wanted to. And there were some cases where they did, like actually with Scipio Africanus against Hannibal. Now, this was the law and a perfectly normal way for soldiers, like for rewarding soldiers for fighting, getting injured, and risking their lives for Rome. Cato fucks this up. Cato successfully stopped the men who risked their lives for Rome from getting the land they were legally owed by the Roman Republic, just to keep Pompey from getting more power. So in essence, Cato was keeping veterans from getting what the state owed them because he didn't like the guy who commanded them. So, what was the result? Unable to get the legislation they needed passed, Pompey and Crassus, who hated each other, decided to team up. And they team up with Julius Caesar. They're like, yeah, look at that Caesar guy. He's a bit young, up-running politician. So they back Caesar, who was running for consul, forming the first triumvirate. Congratulations, Cato! You got your enemies to team up with each other. And that's like either the second or the third time Cato ended up causing his enemies to join forces. Yeah, so that's why I titled this section, Cato Fucks Up Really Bad. Now, Caesar versus Cato, Round 2. Caesar got a dispensation from the Senate to run for consul despite not being old enough to run. Now, Caesar before this was campaigning in Spain and was owed a triumph. This was basically a sort of military parade victorious Roman generals would go on. This triumph was scheduled for after the deadline to announce consul candidacy, which must be done inside of Rome. And the thing is that triumphant generals must be outside of Rome until the triumph. It's a pretty complicated set of laws, but to put it simply, Rome had a city limit known as the Pomerium. Active generals were not allowed inside of the Pomerium, and a Roman consul could become an active or inactive general by exiting or entering the Pomerium. So if Caesar entered the Pomerium, he basically would end up becoming an inactive general, which would give up his right for a triumph. Now, Caesar basically realized the scheduling mistake, if it was a mistake, so he decided to ask for permission to declare his candidacy in absentia. And Cato decided to filibuster the Senate to keep them from voting on this. So, Caesar decided to give up his triumph to get elected consul. So, the consular elections. Caesar was one of the winners. The other winner was Bibulus. And Bibulus is the most disappointing politician in Roman history. The guy's life is basically a massive string of failures, starting with this. So, Caesar had a land reform bill, and now, the main source I'm using on Plutarch is about Cato. I do look in his other sources on guys like Caesar too, but for his land reform bill, the main source I'm using is Cassius Dio, or just, well, Cassius Dio. Now, as a summary of the problems, Rome was overcrowded. There was a land reform bill that would As a summary, Rome was overcrowded. That was a big problem. Many families from the countryside had went into Rome to look for work as their land was getting gobbled up by mega plantations. As a summary, Rome was overcrowded. There were way too many people in it. And Caesar wanted to make a land reform bill that would buy land from willing mega plantations and give them to poor families. So basically, he wasn't taking away anyone's land. He was having the state buy, or he wanted to have the state buy them from rich people who were willing to sell them, who wanted to sell their land. And Caesar made compromise after compromise for this bill. He made sure that it benefited the rich just as much as it benefited the poor. He even exempted land that was directly owned by the Roman state. After everything was done, no one could find any flaws with this bill. Neither of Rome's major political factions had any objections to this. So just think for a moment of how great an achievement for this is. Caesar, imagine if today someone puts forth a bill that no one in the Democrats or the Republicans had objections to, like the bill itself. That's nigh impossible. Or at the very least, it's very difficult. And Caesar managed to do it with, land reform, which was one of the hot-button topics of his time. His skills are just really impressive. So, Cato filibustered Caesar's bill. He didn't object to the bill itself, he objected to Caesar, obviously, because he hated Caesar. Caesar flips his shit. So yeah, Caesar is really pissed off that Cato tried to filibuster his bill. He tries to have Cato arrested for this. The Senate objects incredibly strongly, with one guy even saying he'd rather be in prison with Cato than in the Senate with Caesar. This got Caesar to back down from arresting Cato. But this wasn't the end of this. Caesar decided that if Cato wasn't going to play fair, neither was he. Like the Tribune of the Plebs earlier, Caesar decided to take the bill directly to the public assembly to keep Cato from filibustering it. Cato showed up on voting day with Bibulus. I misspelled his name a few times here. And he had the intention of having Bibulus veto the bill. I guess he managed to bills in Rome had to be out for the public to read for a certain amount of time before they could vote on them. So I'm guessing that Cato managed to convince Bibulus during that time. Especially since the time that he could veto it had presumably passed. But Caesar had already whipped the crowd into a practical riot by the time Cato and Bibulus arrived. The crowd grabbed Bibulus and dumped shit on his head. The bill ended up passing. Now, I'm going to go through a few events quickly to get through things because, this video is already going on for a while. I don't want to make it too long, and it's gonna be long. Anyway, Caesar, after his term as consul, went to govern some Gallic provinces and ended up conquering Gaul during this time. As part of a scheme by a guy named Clodius to keep Cato from helping Cicero, because Clodius had a personal grudge against Cicero, so he sent Cato to annex Cyprus. And then, later on, Pompey and Crassus would run for consul on a joint ticket. Cato convinces his brother-in-law to keep running for consul against Pompey and Crassus. The guy was already thinking of running, but then had doubts when he found out Pompey and Crassus were running. So, Cato and his brother-in-law, on the way to the polls, they get attacked by a gang of thugs, presumably put there by Pompey and or Crassus. Cato is the only one who doesn't run away from them, despite being injured, to his credit. But it still wasn't enough, and Pompey and Crassus won the elections, which they honestly probably would have won anyway. Unless Cato filibustered enough to delay elections. But, God, I don't even think Cato would go that far. But, yeah, so Pompey... Anyway... So Cato runs for praetor in order to try to counter Pompey and Crassus, but Pompey and Crassus rig the election so Cato doesn't win. And, yeah, so, for those who think that Pompey respected the laws of the Republic more than Caesar did, he did not. Not at all. Pompey would do a lot of bad stuff, like election rigging to take power. Now, if we don't do this fast, once again, going through a few events again. So, after their term as consul ends, consuls are given provinces to govern. Same thing with praetors. Cato tried to filibuster a bill to assign Pompey and Crassus provinces. At this point, it seems that people were sick of Cato's filibustering, so they pulled him down from the stages multiple times and threatened to arrest him over it, but Cato still succeeded to filibustering the bill. At least he succeeded for a while before Pompey and Crassus just used violence to pass the law. However, after this, Cato, I suppose to his credit, protected some statues of Pompey that were getting stoned by people who didn't like the violence. I suppose that is to his political, to his credit, but honestly, after everything Pompey and Crassus pulled, if I was in Cato's position, I wouldn't really be on their side. But Cato decided to take Pompey's side even more. He started addressing Pompey regarding the question of Caesar and his provinces. Cato ended up becoming praetor, and somewhat successfully campaigned against bribery, but there were some accusations that he disgraced the office. Getting through more events, so Rome was in a bit of a crisis at the moment. There was open fighting between political factions in the street, elections had been delayed, and there was no government. Or rather, there was still a senate. I wrote this a bit badly here, I suppose. There was a senate, but there was no consul because they kept delaying elections because of the political violence in the streets. So the Senate basically ended up proposing to make Pompey the sole consul. This was 100% illegal, and Cato, to the surprise of everyone, approved of this motion. He said that having one leader was better than no leader, and even though this is hypocritical on Cato's part, I kinda agree with his decision. To approve of it. At this point, Rome was in a state of anarchy, and they needed someone to, come in and solve everything. Though I would point out that the Senate could have made Pompey dictator, but after Sulla, they were a bit understandably hesitant to make anyone dictator, considering how badly Sulla abused that office. But anyway, from this point on, Cato would still say whatever he wanted to, and would criticize Pompey on occasions, but he was basically aligned with Pompey, or at least didn't think Pompey was the worst option out there for leader. Also, some more events. Crassus was killed while invading Parthia, and Caesar's daughter, who was Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. Pompey and Caesar, so there was a big personal loss for both of them here. But for the history of Rome, the more important thing is that with Crassus's death and the death of Caesar's daughter, the triumvirate was broken. Now, Caesar versus Pompey. Caesar's term as governor was coming to an end. Many senators wanted to take away Caesar's armies and provinces before his term came to an end, possibly to arrest him. Cato himself wanted to arrest Caesar the moment he lost his he disbanded his armies. And Caesar did not want to give up his armies and provinces, because the moment he did, people like Cato would arrest him. And his plan was basically to go from being a governor to being a consul again, and then going back to being a governor. Now, this became a big political crisis with Caesar on one side and Pompey on the other. Now, here's how negotiations between the two sides went. Pompey's guys: Caesar must lay down his arms. Caesar's guys: he will if Pompey also lays down his arms. The Senate: we'd be fine with both giving up their armies at the same time. Lentulus, who was a consul, was like, no, absolutely not, vetoed. Now, here I'm using Plutarch, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio as sources, to get a good thing of these events. But yeah, it's basically a bunch of no-use. Now, the final negotiation. So, Caesar was willing to give up everything except 2 provinces and 2 legions. Cicero ended up getting him, talking his allies down into giving up all his forces except for 1 province and 1 legion. Now, with 1 province and 1 legion, Caesar couldn't be arrested. He would have still had too big of an army to really arrest him, but he also wouldn't be a threat to Rome. He couldn't, do anything to Rome then. This was the best deal that they could get from Caesar. He would eliminate himself as a threat, even if they wouldn't be able to arrest him in the end. And I'd like to give a shout out to Cicero, who was trying really hard to bring about a compromise between Caesar and Pompey before things went way too far. So now, with Caesar giving an offer to give up pretty much almost all of his forces and provinces, this gets fucked up. So the offer is mentioned by Suetonius, who says that Caesar's enemies refused to accept it, but it does not mention any particular enemies. Plutarch mentions the offer and claims that Cato and Lentulus were the ones who got in the way. Basically, Cato and Lentulus refused this offer. The Senate then voted to go after Caesar if he didn't disband all his legions by a certain date. So, what happens next? Caesar marches on Rome. Which is something that, even if he did it with only 1 legion, now, he did take 1 legion to march on Rome, but he would have failed utterly if he only had 1 legion, because he still had more legions out there that would end up joining up with his forces. So, yeah, with 1 legion, he could have been crushed by just gathering enough forces, but with the other ones on their way... So, Cato's response. Cato, despite being one of the people pushing Caesar into this position, basically said that he saw it coming. Then again, I suppose if you do push someone into a position, you would kind of... You may not be as... I don't know. But anyway, he told the Senate to let Pompey handle everything, and the Senate ended up agreeing. But Pompey didn't have enough men in Rome to stop Caesar, so Pompey decided to flee the city to build an army. Cato would follow him, but first, Cato had to take care of his family. Cato sent his youngest son out of the city and took his oldest son with him. He then remarried his ex-wife, who was now a rich widow, and left her in charge of his household and daughters in Rome, who he just left there. Even Caesar was a bit confused about Cato's plan for his household. He basically goes, okay, why did Cato remarry his ex-wife and leave her here? The only way this makes sense is if Cato was a gold digger and just wanted the money. Plutarch disagrees and says that Cato wouldn't try to do something like this for personal gain. I'm not 100% sure what to think, but Cato's plan doesn't really make all that much sense. I also have got to say that Cato really was trusting in Caesar's mercy here, abandoning his wife and children, his wife and daughters in Rome while letting his sons leave. Caesar was basically a traitor to Rome at this point, and Cato was either trusting in his mercy or didn't care enough about his daughters in case Caesar tried to do something to them, which Caesar didn't. Either look isn't really all that good for Cato. Now, Cato and Pompey at war with Caesar. Cato convinces Pompey to not sack any Roman cities or kill any Roman outside of battle. Problem they'll have with other competitors too, I suppose. Cato ended up getting sent to get men and ships in Asia, or in this case the Middle East, and he ended up bringing his sister and her son with him. Pompey's commanders in Asia tell Cato that they don't need his help, so he left his sister and nephew there and went back to Pompey, who put him in charge of his fleet. He then changes his mind because Cato might make him lay down his arms too after the war, so he put Bibulus in charge of the fleet instead. As much as I think Cato was an idiot, this was a big mistake. Bibulus failed completely at stopping Caesar from getting to Greece where Pompey was, and he died of a cold at sea. Though I don't doubt Caesar could have, stopped Cato in this instance too, or outsmarted him. It was, Bibulus was undoubtedly the worst choice in this case. More of the war. So Pompey actually won a battle against Caesar, but Caesar was smart enough that he ended up withdrawing his forces before Pompey could destroy his whole army. Pompey left some men with Cato, then went after Caesar, only to suffer a decisive defeat at Pharsalus. Cato then tried to give command of his forces to Cicero, and Cicero was like, no, I'm done with this, and he just went back to Rome. Pompey's son then wanted to punish everyone who fled, including Cicero, but Cato managed to calm him down. Cato then figured out that Pompey was either going to Libya or Egypt. Cato goes to Libya, and Pompey fled to Egypt and got killed there. So that meant that Cato was now in charge of the Pompeians. Looks like their luck ran out, because I do not like their chances with Cato in charge, especially seeing how he seemed a bit too eager to put someone else in charge who might not necessarily be the right person. Well, we'll get more of that later, but anyway. The situation in Libya. Two prominent Romans were already in Libya. One was Scipio, a guy of the Scipio family, who was Pompey's father-in-law. And the other was Varus. Varus was the governor of Libya, who earlier published a book insulting Cato. Now, they were both at the head of an army and were competing with each other by trying to curry the favor of a foreign king. I think his name was Jubus or something. But anyway, Cato managed to actually reconcile them, and they offered to make him their leader, which Cato really should have accepted. Cato refused, both because Scipio outranked him and because he thought the morale boost of them being led by a Scipio in Africa would embolden his men. Because, the most famous member of the Scipio family, Scipio Africanus, defeated Hannibal in Africa. So then Cato put Scipio in charge, and he immediately has to talk him out of slaughtering a city to appease the foreign king. So Cato put Scipio in charge, and he immediately has to talk him out of slaughtering a city to please the foreign king. Not off to a good start. Now, I would like to give who I think Cato should have made the leader. And going by Julius Caesar's own accounts, his former second-in-command in Gaul, the guy who was his second-in-command in Gaul, Labienus, was on the side of the Pompeians. Labienus had fully gone over to the other side and was doing everything he could to defeat Caesar. Labienus was a veteran commander who knew how Caesar fought and could be considered to be on Caesar's level. In fact, later on, after Caesar defeated Labienus in Spain, Caesar would say that he fought for his life at that battle, not as opposed to just fighting for victory. Now, in his account on the war in Africa, Caesar mentions Labienus more than he mentions Cato. I think Labienus would have been a much better choice for Cato putting in charge than Scipio, especially since Scipio wasn't like a legendary commander or anywhere near Labienus' level. Now, things go bad between Cato and Scipio. Cato, it basically goes, okay, Scipio, Caesar is a veteran commander. You should try to avoid fighting him if you can. Let him wear his forces out. Scipio refuses and calls Cato a coward. He says that he's content to hide behind city walls like a coward. So Cato's like, okay, if you want to fight Caesar, let's go to Italy and force him to change his tactics. Scipio also refuses this. Now I'm going to read Plutarch's own words on Cato's feelings at the time this was happening. It is very clear that Cato was distressed at having declined the command, being convinced that Scipio would neither conduct the war nor, in case he should have unexpected good fortune, behave with moderation towards his fellow citizens in the hour of victory. Yeah, Cato told his friends that no matter who wins, the war will not go well. So yeah, even Cato in this case realized how much he fucked up. So, the Battle of Thapsus. Caesar crushes Scipio's forces. Labienus flees to Spain. Scipio and the foreign king survive, but the Pompeian cause in Africa is ruined. Cato's response. Cato was hanging out in a city at the time, and they had a bit of a freak out when Cato's side lost. Cato managed to calm them down, and he gathered all the senators that were with him and 300 Romans who happened to be there in the area. He gathered them in the Temple of Jupiter. Now, I say 300 Romans, and Plutarch's wording is a bit confusing. He describes the 300 Romans as Cato's Senate, but he also says that they were in Rome for various of their own means, and he mentions that they weren't of the senatorial class. So I'm guessing that Cato was like, okay, you 300, you're Romans who are in the city. You are, for all intents and purposes, part of the city, is part of, like, the Senate, because, like, this place is full of barbarians aside from you guys. Now, according to Plutarch, Cato makes a speech where he basically tells the senators to not freak out, but that if they want to run away or side with him or fight Caesar, they can go ahead and do whatever they wanted. This gets them to side with him for the moment, and they try to form a new army by offering to free slaves in exchange for military service. Yes, they've gotten desperate enough to the point where they're arming their slaves. Although they're freeing them at the same time, so I'm not sure if that 100% counts, but oh well. Now, the majority of those 300 guys, the 300 Romans, end up going, why are we involved in this? This isn't our war, like, we're just guys who happen to be in this city. We don't want to fight Caesar. We don't want to get killed. So they end up changing their minds and start plotting against Cato to side with Caesar. And it gets to a point where when some soldiers who are loyal to the Pompeian side go over to and try to, like, help out Cato, Cato's like, look, just go hang out with the foreign king. Like, leave us be. Now, the people of the city that Cato was hanging out in start to get worried that Cato will get them attacked by Caesar by being there. They even start openly suggesting that they detain the senators until Caesar arrives. The 300 were also a threat. Now, there was a lot of political maneuvering and shifting allegiances involving the aforementioned soldiers loyal to the Pompeians who were some horsemen, which, come to think of it, at this period probably means they were auxiliaries and thus people who weren't Romans. So, yeah, that might be why Cato told them to hang out with the foreign king. But anyway, it involved these horsemen, the people of the city, and those 300 Romans. In the end, one of Caesar's allies shows up with 2 legions. The horsemen decide to just plunder the city. Cato can't get enough allies together to do anything about Caesar or Caesar's allies, and Cato decides to kill himself. Now the death of Cato the Younger. So Cato's son and some of his servants try to hide Cato's sword from him so he won't kill himself. Remember that Cato also has another son and several daughters, all of whom he's basically abandoning by dying here. Cato ends up trying to, make his servants give him his sword, even hitting one, and hurts his hand in hitting it, causing an inflammation. He ends up convincing someone else to give him his sword. Then Cato tries to stab himself, but the inflammation caused his initial stab to go awry, and resulted in him surviving it. A doctor manages to stitch his wounds together. But Cato's still determined to kill himself, so he rips open the stitches and pulls his own guts out. So yeah, he basically committed seppuku, except without a guy to decapitate him to make the death painless. Or well, not painless, but relatively painless. So in conclusion, Cato did some things right. He did get some things right, but he messed up horribly on so many levels. He also had far less principles than most people think he did, using the filibuster to defy the resolutions of the Roman state, while also, when it already has measures to protect the political minority from the political majority. And also avoiding things that were necessary or legal and good, like giving the Roman men things that they were promised for fighting for Rome, to get at his political enemies. And he also chose death over being spared by Caesar, because, Caesar almost certainly would have spared him. And if he did get spared, that would have given him a chance to keep plotting against Caesar. Cato was very... Well, there is one thing I can 100% agree on personality assessments about Cato. To the very end, Cato was stubborn.